Hello and welcome everyone. In this podcast that covers day 3 material, we're going to focus on Charles Darwin and some of the observations he made, as well as look at the way experiments are designed and performed. We're going to begin with Charles Darwin and the observations he made that led to his ideas on natural selection. So let's write natural selection here. And we're going to talk about how he came up with this idea. And we're going to talk about it at a very kind of basic level, because towards the end of the semester we're going to come back to it. However, since the foundation of biology is largely based on natural selection and evolution, it's appropriate that at the beginning of a course on biology that we discuss natural selection and evolution. And then we'll come back to it. Now, before we talk about natural selection, I want to talk about another term that Charles Darwin came up with. That term was called descent with modification. It's a very interesting phrase. So what did he mean by descent with modification? Essentially what he meant was that you would have these ancestral species. And our current species, those that are living today, and those that lived when Darwin was making these observations, that these current species were formed through a succession of adaptations from this ancestral species. As a result, they share many features seen in these ancestral species, but they are also unique in a way to best suit their environment. For instance, in your textbook, the authors look at 3 bird species. And if you want to look at figure 1.17, you'll see that the authors show a picture of a flamingo, a European robin, and a penguin. Now, all 3 of these birds share many common features. All 3 of them have feathers, they have a beak, they have wings, so very common features, which they got from this ancestral species. However, you can see that they're quite different. If you look at the penguin, it has adapted to meet its more water environment. It doesn't fly, but it swims using those same wings and feathers. The flamingo has a very long neck, whereas the European robin is a very small bird. So they have adapted in certain ways to suit their environment, but they share many of those common features. So he called this descent with modification. So how did these new species, these current species, how were they selected over time? Or how is it that they came to exist? Why do we see this descent with modification? And we see it because of natural selection. Darwin explained natural selection by 3 big picture observations. The first observation is that in a given population, the members of that population will vary in their traits. So remember, a population is a group of organisms of the same species. So let's draw some organisms here in a defined space. And we're going to make them look different. We're going to have some red round ones. We're going to have some green triangles. Obviously these are just kind of generic species just to make the point. Maybe we're going to have some purple circle ones. Maybe even a couple purple triangles. There's going to be a lot of diversity here. They're not all going to look the same. They're going to look a little different. And this is what we see in most populations. We do see some diversity. We'll make some orange diamonds. Maybe we'll make some circles that are blue, but they're going to be filled in. So this was his first observation, that within any given population you see considerable diversity. However, he also observed, and others observed this too, that in any given population, the members of that population will produce far more offspring than it can maintain. Meaning, when we look at this population here, not all of these will be able to survive and produce offspring of their own. Only some of them will. So that was his second observation. In addition with this second observation, he recognized that since only some of these will survive to make more progeny, more offspring, that this is going to cause competition. And only those organisms that are the most fit will survive. So we often hear this phrase called survival of the fittest. And it's often misinterpreted in popular media. Often when we hear this term, we think of it as being those organisms that are the strongest, the fastest maybe, or the most muscle mass. That's not what we mean. When we say that an organism is more fit than another organism, what we're saying is that that fit organism makes more progeny. And we'll come back to this later. The most fit organism in this population is going to be the organism that makes the most progeny, the most offspring. It may be the smallest, it may be the slowest, it may be the weakest, but it's going to make more progeny. The other thing that Darwin observed, his third observation, was that organisms within a population tend to suit their environment. For instance, let's pretend that the environment where this population is existing is in a grass field. So I'm just going to kind of draw some green here to kind of symbolize that there's grass here. So again, we have lots of progeny. These progeny can't all survive. There's going to be some progeny within this population here that will be more fit. And as I drew this, I intentionally drew it in a certain way, where these green triangles, because they are camouflaged with this green grass, they're going to turn out to be more fit in this example I'm providing. And that is because these red, blue, purple, orange progeny are going to be quickly eaten up by predators because they stand out. Now some of them might survive because we're always going to have some diversity within a population. But the majority of the organisms in this population are going to be our green triangles. And again, it's because they are the most fit. Not necessarily the strongest, but because they're not getting eaten by other predators in this population, I mean in this area, this environment, they survive. So they are more fit because they produce more offspring. So they're going to make another triangle, green triangle, just simply because they're not being eaten. So that's how Darwin explained natural selection, and ultimately a large part of evolution, that those organisms within a population that are better suited for that environment will make more progeny, and they will evolve. The next thing I would like to talk about includes how scientists make predictions and test hypotheses. To start off, I want to talk about qualitative data versus quantitative data. Qualitative, if you think of the root word quality, what we're thinking about here is more descriptive. Whereas quantitative data often implies that we're thinking about numbers, some kind of value, or counting something. However, I want to point out that whether we're talking about qualitative or quantitative data, they're still data. Sometimes we think quantitative data is really the data because we think data has to have numbers. But qualitative observations are also data. When we think about qualitative versus quantitative data, your book introduces you to a very famous scientist, Jane Goodall. And she did both qualitative and quantitative data. For her qualitative data, she spent many years making observations of chimpanzees in Africa, describing the way they looked, describing their behavior, describing what they did as a family unit or individually. These were very much a descriptive type of biology. Very important to understand how these chimpanzees lived and interacted. She also obtained very valuable quantitative data. For instance, she might have noted, or she did note, how many times they fed each day, how long they might have slept, how far might they have traveled. These are all numbers, values, and ways of counting. So those would have been quantitative data. Many scientists will combine these and will use both qualitative and quantitative data in their studies. Next, I want to talk about this term called hypothesis. What is a hypothesis? Your book gives a definition that I like quite a bit, and that is a tentative answer to a well-framed question. A hypothesis should be based on observations and available data. Maybe it was an experiment that was performed previously, maybe it's an experiment performed by someone else, but there's some data that you're basing this hypothesis on. It's not just a guess. A hypothesis will lead to a prediction that can be tested. We often think of this other term related to this called hypothesis testing. We can think of this as just a way that we evaluate data between two possible hypotheses. Your book provides a classic example of how we can think about a hypothesis and how we might test it. And they present this from a scenario where you come across a flashlight that doesn't work. The question now is, why doesn't this flashlight work? Now, based upon our years of living, we know there's several reasons why a flashlight might not work. These would be linked to observations that we've made in the past. For instance, we might think that the flashlight isn't working because the batteries are dead. Maybe the bulb was burned out. You could probably come up with many other hypotheses. But we're just going to test between these two hypotheses. And remember, we said that a hypothesis has to have a prediction that can be tested. So in this first hypothesis, the batteries are dead. That's why the flashlight's not working. Well, the prediction would be, if we replace the batteries, that'll fix the problem and the flashlight will work. So this is a very easily tested hypothesis. We put new batteries in, and now we do the test. We look, and we turn on the flashlight. If it doesn't work, we say our hypothesis is contradicted. It is not the correct hypothesis. But we'll test this other one. Maybe the bulb is burnt out. So the prediction would be, replace the bulb, and that will fix the problem. So that's easy to test. You replace the bulb and you flip the flashlight on, and wouldn't you know it, now the flashlight's working. So this hypothesis in this case is supported. The flashlight was not working because the bulb was burnt out. It's a very straightforward and simple way to think about a hypothesis. Now your challenge will be to think about building a hypothesis and thinking about how we could test a hypothesis within a scientific framework. And we'll have some examples in class that we'll work through on this, and we'll come back to this throughout the semester every now and then. Now, when scientists do experiments, even if it's this experiment looking at the flashlights, the experiments are done in a controlled manner. So let's talk about what a controlled experiment is. Some kinds of experiments, there are no controls, and they can't be controlled experiments. But let's think about what an example of a controlled experiment is. A controlled experiment will be set up in such a way where you can compare an experimental group to a control group. So the flashlight example, the flashlight not working is the experimental group. And I just abbreviated experimental group with EXP. So what would the control group be in our flashlight experiment? Well, the control group might be a working flashlight without batteries, if we're testing the hypotheses that the batteries are burnt out. So you'd want to know what that flashlight looked without batteries, and then what it looked like with fresh batteries in it. And then you can compare this control group with our experimental group when we add new batteries, and see if this experimental group, where we take the batteries out and we put them back in, does that look like our experimental group? Ideally, when we do a controlled experiment, we only want to change one variable. So up here, we're only going to worry about the batteries. That's the only variable we're going to change. And when we test that hypothesis, if it's not supported, then we'll do another controlled experiment where we look only at the bulb. We only control one variable. The next thing I want to talk about is something we will call a model organism. Some examples of a model organism would be like a fruit fly, Drosophila. Might be a mouse. It could be a plant model organism. A popular one would be Arabidopsis. Bacteria, like E. coli, would be another really important model organism. A single-celled eukaryote, like yeast, would be another good model organism. An organism like humans is not a good model organism. So let's explain why. What are some features of a model organism that makes it a good model organism? One thing is they reproduce quickly. They're usually small, easy to maintain, simple to do experiments with. Or another way you could say that they're easy. Another way we could say that is that they are easy to manipulate. They are typically cheaper to work with. And another thing about model organisms, and all organisms have this, but what we learn about a fruit fly or a mouse or a Arabidopsis or E. coli or yeast applies to all other organisms. What we learn about a fruit fly tells us a lot about what a mouse does. What we learn about Arabidopsis can help us understand humans, because we all share a common origin, and so we all have a very similar genetic makeup. So why are humans or elephants or rhinoceroses not good model organisms? Well, we can see up here they don't reproduce really quickly. They're certainly not small. They would not be easy to maintain in a laboratory. They're not simple to work with. People frown when we intentionally mutate humans, so that's not a good strategy. And they're not cheaper either. Model organisms tend to be very important in basic biology research because we can do a lot more experiments with these organisms, and what we learn about them tells us a lot about more complex organisms, like humans. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about is this word called theory. In popular media and in our society, we often hear this word theory and think it means an untested speculation. We often hear people say, it's just a theory. Well, in science, a theory is much stronger than that. In fact, a theory is very strong. When somebody says something is a theory in science, that means that it is well supported. So how is a theory different than a hypothesis? The first is that a theory covers a much broader scope. Second, a single theory will produce several new hypotheses. Because this theory covers a really broad scope, it's going to create new questions that need to be addressed by these new hypotheses. And this third point is probably one of the more important differences. A theory is supported by a greater body of evidence. And this body of evidence often will come from different fields, different angles, different approaches. It's not just one field or one discipline that has made these kinds of predictions and tested them. It's multiple fields coming together at a central question from different angles and different experimental approaches. For instance, the theory of gravity isn't based solely because when we drop something from a tree and it hits the ground. There are other observations that have been made from other fields that support the theory of gravity. Okay, that's all I have for this podcast. If you have any questions at all, please make sure you come see me, and I'll do my best to answer any questions you might have. See you in class. Bye.